Hi everyone. So this training is on consequences. So you may have already watched the video on antecedents. So as we talked about a little bit in that one is when we are analyzing behavior, whether it's a challenging behavior or just a behavior that we want to increase, we look at the ABCs. The A is antecedent, B is behavior, and C is consequence. So, in sequential order, the consequence is what happens directly after behavior. Oftentimes, when I say the word consequence, families think that it's a negative reaction or some type of disciplinary action, which is not the case necessarily. We're just simply looking at what directly comes after the behavior of interest. So we're looking at things that we said or did and also how the child responds to that. So when we are analyzing, let's say, a challenging behavior, say we're looking at hitting siblings. The antecedent may be sibling took toy. The behavior of interest is that the child hit the sibling, and then the consequence is what we're looking for is exactly what was said or did. So in this scenario, maybe we reprimanded the child for hitting, or maybe we put them in timeout. Or a consequence can simply be that the child gave the toy back. So we're looking at exactly what it is that followed the behavior of interest. So some questions that we typically answer is, what did you say to the child, if anything? How did you respond? So did you take something away? Did you give them something? Did you prompt them to do something? And then the other thing that we typically would answer is, were there other people involved? And if so, how did they respond to the behavior? So such as the sibling in that scenario, did the sibling respond in a certain way? Was a sibling crying? And then also how the child responded. So if we're looking at, they aggress towards the sibling and now the sibling's on the floor crying, what's the child's reaction right now? Are they now crying too? Are they laughing because the sibling's crying? So just kind of looking at that body language, and if they're saying something, all of that information is important to note because it's helpful with us making our decisions about the behavior plan. And in a previous training, we talked about functions of behavior. So any of that information that you have is helpful for us. For example, if you're noticing that your child is laughing because the sibling is crying, that tells us that there's probably some type of attention-seeking function from that, and they're getting something out of that because they're smiling in response to that. So if they're smiling, that kind of tells us that they're liking the reaction that they're getting from the sibling. So that's important for us to know because it kind of drives our decisions in terms of what a behavior plan would be. So I know we talked about this a little bit in our functions of behavior training too, but I'm going to touch on it a little bit again. But in terms of specific consequences that we would provide, so I just talked a little bit about what questions we answered to determine our course of action, and then kind of once we have the information to know what the function of the behavior is that we're looking at, then we look at specific consequences and what's appropriate. So I know typically from a parenting standpoint, we look at timeout is a big one, reprimanding is a big one. Obviously, in the field of behavior analysis, we're working with children that aren't our own kids. So we don't typically, those are considered punishment consequences. So we don't typically use those unless we're dealing with a severely self-injurious type of behavior or severe aggression. Punishment's typically reserved for those types of things because it is effective and it's a quick fix. However, it's not socially appropriate for us to always use that, and reinforcement does work. So one of the main things that we look at first is the maintaining consequence. So like I said in a previous example, or a previous video, we talked about the general functions of behavior. So in looking at a behavior that's maintained by attention, the consequence that we would typically provide for that is to not provide attention, contingent on the behavior occurring. So in the example of, a sibling aggresses towards a peer or towards another sibling because they get a reaction out of it, or a reaction from you that shows us that it's attention seeking. So typically the consequence that we would provide is to not provide attention, contingent on them aggressing towards the peer, and we would teach them an appropriate way to gain your attention. Another example of a consequence that we would provide is for an escape function. So a child who is engaging in a challenging behavior to get out of working, we would follow through with the demand that we presented. So we can kind of alleviate that function, and then we would teach them an appropriate way to communicate that they need a break, or they need more time with the activity that they're doing, or that they need assistance with the activity, just so we know that they have the appropriate communication skills to request that. So those are just a few examples of consequences that we would provide, and I'm not going to go through all the functions just because I kind of wanted you to get a snapshot of what an actual consequence is. Like I said, consequence sounds like it's some type of like punishment procedure or a response to a negative response to a challenging behavior. And that's not always the case. It's basically exactly what I just said. It's whatever you're doing or saying and the child's doing or saying that directly follows the behavior that you're looking to increase or decrease. So again, in terms of implementation of what we would do about that, we would really look at the function and learn why it's happening, which we're able to determine by knowing as much information as we can about our antecedents and consequences. And then once we know the function, then we will put in some sort of behavior plan to help reduce the behavior by implementing specific antecedents and consequences that are based around the function. And that is it on consequence. Thanks, you guys.